They always say no single player is bigger than the league. It's one of those lines that sounds powerful, fair, and responsible. Commissioners repeat it. Executives hide behind it. Veterans use it as a shield. But every once in a while, a league runs into a problem it can't slogan its way out of. A moment where reality doesn't match the message anymore. And right now, the WNBA is living inside that contradiction. Because something quietly flipped behind the scenes. Not during a game. Not during a press conference. But during a media announcement that didn't sound dramatic on the surface, yet sent shockwaves through the league office. When NBC made its move, it didn't just secure broadcast rights. It sent a message about who actually drives attention, ratings, and money. And once that message landed, the balance of power shifted almost overnight. What makes this story explosive isn't just Caitlin Clark's rise. It's the realization spreading through the front office that the league may no longer be in control of its own biggest asset. That the commissioner isn't setting the narrative anymore. That media companies, sponsors, and fans have already chosen their centerpiece, and they're not waiting for permission. Behind closed doors, frustration is reportedly boiling over. Not because the league is losing relevance, but because it's gaining it in a way that can't be tightly managed. The old playbook was built on collective branding, careful optics, and spreading attention evenly. The new reality is messier, louder, and brutally honest. Attention doesn't distribute itself fairly. It concentrates. And at the center of that concentration is one name. This isn't just a basketball story. It's a power story. About what happens when a league built on control runs into a star the market refuses to ignore. And how one NBC announcement may have confirmed the commissioner's worst fear. That Caitlin Clark doesn't need the WNBA nearly as much as the WNBA now needs her. But to understand why this moment hit so hard, you have to understand what that NBC announcement really represented, and why it felt less like a partnership and more like a takeover. On paper, the NBC deal looks like a victory lap, a historic media agreement, billions in projected value, national exposure, validation that the WNBA has arrived in a serious way. From the outside, it feels like the commissioner should be celebrating, smiling at podiums, talking about growth and opportunity. And publicly, that's exactly how it was framed. But inside the league, the mood was reportedly very different. Because media deals aren't just about airtime. They're about influence. They're about who gets promoted, who gets prime slots, who becomes the face viewers associate with the product. Networks don't spend billions to spread attention evenly. They spend to maximize return. And return, in modern sports media, is driven by one thing above all else: magnetism. NBC didn't enter this partnership thinking about roster balance or long-term league philosophy. They entered it asking a far simpler question. Who makes people stop scrolling? Who makes casual viewers tune in? Who turns highlights into headlines? The answer wasn't subtle, and it didn't require focus groups. It was Caitlin Clark. This is where the tension begins. Because for decades, the WNBA has marketed itself around the idea of collective value. Every player matters. Every story deserves shine. The league identity was built on equality of attention, not hierarchy. That philosophy worked when exposure was limited and expectations were modest. But the moment mainstream media money shows up, that philosophy collides with reality. NBC isn't interested in selling parity. They're interested in selling moments. They want ratings spikes, viral clips, recognizable faces. And the moment their strategy leaned heavily toward Clark-centric promotion, it quietly bypassed the league's traditional chain of command. Because the commissioner can suggest narratives, but she can't dictate what networks choose to spotlight. That's the part that reportedly stung. When NBC signals, through scheduling choices and promotional focus, that one player is the engine, it strips the league office of its ability to enforce the everyone is equal message. The power doesn't disappear, it relocates. From league executives to broadcast partners. From internal philosophy to external demand. And once that shift happens, it's almost impossible to reverse. What makes this even more uncomfortable is that the league can't openly push back. You don't challenge the company writing the checks. You don't tell a network how to run its programming when your future revenue depends on their satisfaction. So instead of control, the commissioner is left managing optics. Trying to maintain internal peace while external forces reshape the hierarchy anyway. The NBC announcement wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But insiders recognized it immediately for what it was, a signal. a declaration that the market has already chosen its centerpiece, that the era of pretending otherwise is coming to an end. And once that realization sinks in, it creates a domino effect. Because if one network is willing to center everything around a single star, others will follow. Sponsors notice. Advertisers adjust. Storylines narrow. And suddenly, the league's biggest challenge isn't growth, it's dependence. That's when frustration turns into fear. Because when your business momentum is tied so tightly to one person, you don't just promote them, you protect them. You listen to them. You adapt around them. And that means the traditional power structure starts to crack. The commissioner is no longer the final authority. She becomes the mediator between a superstar economy and a league that wasn't built to function that way. And this was only the first crack. Because just as the league was processing the NBC implications, Caitlin Clark made a decision that confirmed what many inside the front office were starting to worry about. A decision that wasn't loud, but was impossible to ignore. And that decision made one thing clear. She wasn't just playing the game anymore. She was choosing where her leverage lived. For years, the WNBA's strongest talking point wasn't dominance, or dynasties, or superstars. It was balance. The idea that no single name should outweigh the league itself. That the product was the product. That attention should be spread, not concentrated. Internally, this wasn't just marketing, it was a survival strategy. Because when a league doesn't have mainstream leverage, control becomes everything. The commissioner's office built its authority around that concept. If everyone is equally important, then no one gets special treatment. No one can demand schedule changes. No one can bend media rules. No one becomes bigger than the system. That philosophy kept the locker room stable, kept veteran voices powerful, and kept the league office firmly in charge. But that system was designed for a different era. The moment Caitlin Clark entered the picture, the math stopped working. Viewership patterns shifted. Ticket demand spiked in specific cities. Jersey sales exploded in a way the league hadn't seen before. Suddenly, the equal attention model wasn't matching audience behavior anymore. Fans weren't spreading their interest evenly. They were clustering around one storyline. That's where the tension quietly turned hostile. Because when a league preaches equality, but the audience behaves hierarchically, someone has to make a choice. Either you lean into the demand, or you try to resist it. And for a long time, the WNBA tried to resist. Not openly, but structurally. Through messaging. Through scheduling philosophy. Through media framing that emphasized teams and rivalries over individuals. NBC shattered that illusion. By signaling that their coverage would lean heavily toward Clark-driven narratives, the network forced a question the league didn't want to answer yet. If broadcasters are treating the WNBA like a star vehicle, can the commissioner realistically stop them? And if she can't stop them, can she still claim control over the league's identity? That's where the pressure started squeezing from both sides. On one side, veteran players and longtime insiders who believed the league was being reduced to a one-player show. On the other, corporate partners who didn't care about tradition, they cared about numbers. And numbers don't lie. Ratings don't negotiate. They respond. The commissioner was suddenly trapped in a no-win position. Push back against the networks and risk being seen as hostile to growth. Lean into the star and risk alienating the locker room and the players' union. Either move fractures something. And the most dangerous part, Caitlin Clark wasn't asking for any of this. She didn't demand the spotlight. She didn't campaign for favoritism. The attention followed her anyway. That made it even harder to manage, because there was no villain to point to. No policy violation. No headline you could correct. Just a market doing what markets do, rewarding what people want to see. Inside league offices, this created a quiet resentment. Not always toward Clark herself, but toward the situation. Toward the feeling that control was slipping. That the carefully balanced ecosystem they built was being overtaken by forces they couldn't discipline or fine or vote down. Because you can regulate players. You can't regulate audiences. And once the audience starts choosing favorites loudly, every internal decision becomes political. Every scheduling choice looks intentional. Every media appearance feels loaded. Every quote gets dissected. That's when the commissioner's job stops being about governance and starts being about damage control. What made it worse was the timing. The league wasn't just dealing with a rising star. It was dealing with expansion plans, increased sponsor interest, and more eyes than ever before. Mistakes that once stayed inside niche circles were now being replayed, clipped, and debated across mainstream platforms. The margin for error vanished. And just as the league was trying to stabilize this new reality, Caitlin Clark made a move that changed how everyone viewed her position in the power structure. A move that told executives, veterans, and fans alike that she wasn't waiting to be managed. She was choosing her own lane. Because when she was presented with an offer designed to pull her deeper into the league's ecosystem, she did the unthinkable. She walked away. And that's when quiet concern turned into full-blown panic. There's a difference between turning down an offer and sending a message. When reports surfaced about the off-season league making an aggressive push for Caitlin Clark, most people assumed it was a formality. Of course she'd say yes. Why wouldn't she? The offer wasn't subtle. It wasn't cautious. It was built to be irresistible. Big money. Massive visibility. A chance to align herself with some of the most powerful names in women's basketball during a period when the spotlight was already on her. From the league's perspective, it made perfect sense. This wasn't just about basketball. It was about containment. If Caitlin Clark accepted the offer, she'd be fully embedded inside the ecosystem, playing alongside the stars, sharing attention, contributing to a collective product that diluted individual leverage. It would have been framed as unity, sisterhood, growth for everyone, and most importantly, it would have placed her back under structures the league understood how to manage. That's why the expectation was quiet confidence, the assumption that this was a box being checked. But then the answer came back. No, not delayed, not negotiated, not softened with conditions, just a clean rejection that caught people off guard. And that's when the tone shifted. Because when a rookie turns down millions, not because she has a better offer, but because she doesn't need the platform, it forces everyone to reevaluate the hierarchy. This wasn't about greed. It was about independence. By saying no, Clark did something far more disruptive than taking the money ever could have. She showed that she wasn't chasing validation from the league or its extensions. She wasn't scrambling to maximize short-term earnings. She was building something that existed outside of the traditional power channels. That's what scared people. Because if a player doesn't need your platform, you can't use it as leverage. You can't threaten access. You can't quietly apply pressure. You can't guide their public image as easily. You lose your most effective tools. Inside league circles, the interpretation was immediate. This wasn't just a scheduling choice or a personal preference. It was a flex, a declaration that she could thrive without leaning on the systems that had governed everyone else. And once that idea takes root, it spreads. Veterans started asking uncomfortable questions. Executives started wondering what else she might say no to. Media partners began realizing that her brand wasn't tied exclusively to the league anymore. It was portable, flexible, autonomous. That changes negotiations forever. Because now, if she's unhappy with officiating, travel conditions, security, or media treatment, she doesn't need to complain loudly. She just needs to step back. And in a league whose current momentum is tied to her presence, that possibility is terrifying. This is where the commissioner's frustration reportedly intensified. The job of a commissioner is to maintain balance, to keep stars important but not untouchable, to ensure no individual gains so much leverage that the league itself becomes secondary. Clark's decision made that balance feel fragile, like it could collapse with one wrong move. What made it worse was the optics. From the outside, fans saw a confident star choosing her own path, someone unbothered by pressure, someone who didn't fold to expectations. That image only strengthened her appeal. An appeal translates directly into power, especially when media companies are already invested. Internally, however, it created a new category of concern. Because now, Clark wasn't just the most watched player. She was the least controllable. And that raised a dangerous question inside the front office. What happens if the league can't protect her, can't guide her, and can't afford to lose her? That question lingered uncomfortably as the season progressed. And it became impossible to ignore once fans started pointing out another issue the league seemed unwilling to address. An issue that wasn't about money or media at all. It was about silence. And that silence changed how Caitlin Clark viewed the people in charge. Power doesn't always disappear loudly. Sometimes it erodes quietly, one unanswered moment at a time. As Caitlin Clark's rookie season unfolded, the conversation around her shifted. At first, it was all about performance, deep shots, packed arenas, record-breaking attention. But slowly, another narrative crept in, one that had nothing to do with box scores and everything to do with how she was being treated on the court. Fans started noticing patterns. Physical play that went beyond competitive intensity. Contact that felt unnecessary. Moments that looked less like basketball and more like a message. Whether intentional or not, the perception was unmistakable. Clark was being tested in ways that went beyond normal rookie challenges. And through it all, the league office stayed quiet. No strong statements. No visible intervention. No clear signal that the league's biggest draw was being actively protected. For longtime WNBA insiders, this wasn't shocking. The league had always prided itself on toughness. Physicality was part of the identity. Rookies were expected to adjust, not complain. But this time was different. Because this rookie wasn't just another name on the roster. She was the center of the league's current momentum. And when fans saw silence from the top, they didn't interpret it as neutrality. They saw abandonment. That's where trust started to crack. The commissioner's role, at least in the eyes of the public, isn't just to enforce rules. It's to set tone, to signal what's acceptable and what isn't. When the league's most visible player appeared to be absorbing excessive punishment without vocal support, the silence became louder than any press release. Online, frustration boiled over. Clips circulated. Comment sections filled up. And instead of the focus staying on the games, it shifted toward leadership, or the lack of it. Then came the interview that poured gasoline on the fire. When asked about the growing tension, the fan hostility, and the increasingly toxic discourse surrounding Clark, the commissioner's response didn't land the way it was intended. It sounded corporate, detached, like an executive trying to smooth over optics instead of confronting reality. Comparisons were made to historic rivalries, framed as proof that conflict drives engagement. But fans didn't hear nuance. They heard dismissal. To them, it felt like the league was more interested in protecting veteran sensibilities than acknowledging what was happening in real time. And once that perception took hold, it was impossible to undo. The apology that followed only reinforced the idea that the moment had been mishandled from the start. This was the leadership vacuum. Because in the absence of a strong, protective stance from the league, Clark didn't just lose faith, she adjusted her strategy. If the system wasn't going to shield her, she would find protection elsewhere. Not through confrontation, not through public complaints, but through alignment. This is where the NBC relationship suddenly takes on new meaning. Media giants don't just offer exposure. They offer insulation. They amplify narratives. They shape public opinion. When a network invests heavily in a star, that star becomes untouchable in a different way. Criticism gets scrutinized. Physical play gets replayed in slow motion. Every moment gets context. And Clark didn't have to ask for that protection. It arrived naturally once networks recognized her value. From the commissioner's perspective, this was devastating. Because now, the league wasn't the primary defender of its most valuable player. External forces were. That's a dangerous shift in any sport. It means the commissioner is no longer the final authority on tone, discipline, or image. She's reacting instead of leading. And worse, the locker room noticed. Veteran players saw a star receiving massive attention without what they viewed as paying dues. Fans saw a rookie being targeted without visible support. Media saw a league struggling to control its own narrative. No matter where you stood, the optics were bad. This is the moment the commissioner reportedly realized the situation had slipped beyond her grasp. Because once a player stops believing the league has their back, loyalty fades. And when loyalty fades, leverage grows. Clark didn't need to say a word publicly. Her silence did the talking for her. She wasn't fighting the system. She was moving around it. And just when the league thought things couldn't get more complicated, another decision from earlier in the year resurfaced. One that suddenly looked far more consequential than anyone wanted to admit. A decision that involved the biggest stage in the world, and a name that wasn't on the list. Long before the NBC announcement, long before the silence became controversial, the first real crack in the league's authority had already formed. It happened quietly, wrapped in official language and basketball logic. No shouting, no drama, just a list of names, and one absence that instantly became impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark was left off the Olympic roster. At the time, the explanation sounded reasonable. Experience mattered. Chemistry mattered. This wasn't about popularity. It was about fit, timing, and long-term planning. That was the public message, and from a strictly basketball perspective, it was defensible. But perception doesn't care about defensibility. Fans didn't see a roster decision. They saw a statement. To many, it felt like gatekeeping, like a reminder that no matter how much attention Clark brought to the sport, she was still expected to wait her turn. That narrative spread fast, especially among new fans who didn't have years of league context to soften the blow. And then the business side started whispering. Because the Olympics aren't just basketball. They're a global marketing machine, a once-every-4 years opportunity to capture casual viewers who don't follow league play but recognize stars. And Caitlin Clark, whether the league liked it or not, was already one of the most recognizable names in women's basketball worldwide. That's where the tension quietly shifted from sports to money. NBC, the network responsible for broadcasting the Olympics, understood the stakes immediately. Star power equals viewership. Viewership equals advertising. And advertising equals revenue. Leaving the most searched, most talked about player off the roster didn't just impact the team, it impacted potential reach. From the network's perspective, it looked like a missed opportunity. Not because Clark was owed a spot, but because the moment demanded maximum exposure. And exposure follows attention, not tradition. This is where memory matters. Media companies don't forget moments when their business interests take a hit. They adjust. They compensate. They correct course the next time leverage is in their hands. And when the WNBA media rights came up, NBC suddenly had that leverage. So when the league saw NBC aggressively centering Caitlin Clark in their future coverage, it didn't feel random. It felt like a recalibration, a way of saying, we won't miss the moment twice. From the commissioner's seat, this was deeply uncomfortable, because it meant the league's earlier decision, however justified internally, had ripple effects far beyond the court. It meant that the Olympic snub wasn't just a fan controversy anymore. It was part of a larger narrative about who understood the modern sports economy and who didn't. The commissioner publicly stood by the Olympic selection. She had to. Anything else would have undermined the process. But behind the scenes, the cost of that stance was becoming clearer by the day. NBC's renewed focus on Clark felt less like promotion and more like correction. And once that door opened, it couldn't be closed. The network wasn't going to let internal league politics dictate their programming decisions again. That realization added another layer to the commissioner's frustration. Because now, every move Clark made was being evaluated through a different lens. Not as a rookie learning the league, but as a global asset navigating an ecosystem that may not have fully embraced her when it mattered most. And for Clark, the lesson was simple. The biggest stage in the world didn't come from waiting in line. It came from aligning with the forces that controlled the spotlight. That alignment would soon put the commissioner in an even more impossible position. Because the Olympic fallout didn't just affect the league office. It poured gasoline on existing tensions inside the locker room. And once veteran voices started pushing back publicly, the situation escalated from uncomfortable to volatile. At some point, every power shift creates resistance. As Caitlin Clark's presence continued to dominate headlines, a familiar reaction began to surface, one rooted in pride, history, and fear of being erased. Veteran players and longtime figures around the league started pushing back, not always directly, but enough for fans to notice. Comments minimizing her impact. Refusals to credit her influence. Subtle framing that suggested the hype was exaggerated, temporary, or undeserved. To the veterans, this wasn't personal. It was existential. Many of them had spent years fighting for relevance, recognition, and respect in a league that rarely offered any of it. Now suddenly, a rookie was drawing crowds, driving ratings, and attracting mainstream media attention they never had access to. The resentment wasn't hard to understand, even if it was risky to express. But this is where the landscape had changed. In the past, those comments would have stayed inside niche circles, debated by dedicated fans, forgotten by the next news cycle. This time, they didn't disappear. They spread. Clips were shared. Quotes were replayed. And every dismissive remark only amplified the perception that the league was hostile to its own biggest draw. The media noticed. And media companies don't tolerate anything that damages the product they're selling. As criticism of Clark from respected voices grew louder, so did the backlash. Fans demanded accountability. Sponsors quietly paid attention. Networks evaluated risk. Because from a broadcast perspective, undermining the star doesn't just create controversy, it threatens engagement. That's when the tone shifted. Commentators who appeared resistant to Clark's rise suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Assignments changed. Appearances faded. Messaging softened. Whether intentional or coincidental, the signal was clear. Negativity toward the league's most valuable storyline was no longer harmless opinion. It was bad for business. This was another blow to the commissioner's authority. Traditionally, legends were protected, revered, given space to speak freely. Their voices shaped the league's culture. But now, the media partners were drawing their own lines. And those lines didn't align neatly with internal hierarchies. To the commissioner, this felt like losing the narrative twice. First to the audience, then to the broadcasters. Because once networks start signaling who is helpful and who is harmful to the product, the league office becomes reactive. Instead of guiding conversation, it chases it. Instead of enforcing culture, it negotiates around ratings. And the locker room felt it. Players who had spent years earning respect through longevity suddenly realized that tenure mattered less than traction. That name recognition outside the league outweighed reputation inside it. And that realization fueled even more resentment. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one wanted to say out loud. The audience had already chosen. The constant debates, the dismissive comments, the awkward interviews, they didn't slow Caitlin Clark's momentum. They accelerated it. Every attempt to downplay her only confirmed what fans already believed, that she was disrupting a system that wasn't built to handle her. And disruption draws attention. For the commissioner, this was the nightmare scenario. A divided locker room, a divided fan base, media partners prioritizing profit over tradition, and a star who didn't need to fight back because the numbers were doing it for her. At this point, the question wasn't whether Caitlin Clark was the face of the league. The question was how long the league could pretend she wasn't. And the answer, as it turned out, was tied directly to the one thing that doesn't care about feelings, legacies, or internal politics: money. Because once the financial reality came into focus, there was no room left for denial. At the end of the day, every argument, every quote, every cultural debate circles back to one thing: money. For most of its existence, the WNBA didn't operate like a traditional professional league. It survived through subsidies, patience, and long-term belief. Losses were expected. Growth was gradual. Stability mattered more than profit. That reality shaped how the league governed itself, how power was distributed, and how stars were handled. Then Caitlin Clark arrived. And suddenly, the numbers started changing. Arenas that once struggled to fill sections were selling out. Road games felt like home games for her. Jersey sales didn't just rise. They spiked at levels the league had never experienced. Search trends exploded. Social engagement multiplied. Corporate interest intensified almost overnight. This wasn't gradual growth. It was a surge. And surges are dangerous if you don't control what's driving them. Inside the commissioner's office, the financial reality became impossible to ignore. The league's recent momentum wasn't evenly distributed across all teams or all players. It was concentrated, fragile, built around one gravitational force pulling attention wherever she went. That changes everything. Because when revenue becomes dependent on a single draw, leverage shifts instantly. The traditional employer-employee dynamic flips. The league doesn't just employ the player sustains the ecosystem. That's a terrifying position for any commissioner. If Caitlin Clark were to miss extended time, if she chose to step back, if she decided her interests were better served elsewhere, the financial ripple wouldn't be minor. It would be seismic. Media partners would ask questions. Sponsors would hesitate. Momentum would stall. And everyone in power knows it. This is where the frustration reportedly turned into something sharper: anxiety. Because the NBC deal didn't just promise money. It came with expectations, viewership benchmarks, engagement goals, advertising confidence. And while those details aren't public, the implication is obvious. The league's biggest commercial moments are now expected to feature its biggest commercial asset. That asset isn't a team. It's a person. And that person doesn't need to threaten anything to hold power. The math does it for her. This is why the commissioner's authority feels diminished. Not because she lost her title, but because her margin for resistance evaporated. In the past, she could prioritize parity. She could defend unpopular decisions. She could lean on philosophy. Now, every decision is weighed against one question: does this keep the engine running? If the answer is no, the pressure comes fast. Networks call. Sponsors nudge. Advisors warn. And suddenly, the commissioner isn't setting terms, she's responding to consequences. What makes this even more uncomfortable is that the league's solvency now feels conditional, built on momentum that can't afford disruption. That's not how commissioners like to operate. Stability is supposed to come from structure, not stardom. But the structure didn't create this moment. The star did. And that realization reframes everything. Scheduling debates, media access, security decisions, travel standards, even officiating conversations. Because once the league understands how much is riding on one name, neutrality becomes a luxury it can't afford. This is the moment where power officially changes hands. Not in a contract, not in a press release, but in quiet internal calculations where everyone realizes who the economy revolves around. And once that happens, the question isn't whether the league will adapt. It's how fast. Because the next battleground wasn't money. It was control. And it showed up somewhere fans noticed immediately. The schedule. Schedules are supposed to be boring. Dates, times, travel logistics. Something fans glance at once and forget. But early in Caitlin Clark's season, the schedule stopped feeling neutral. It started feeling intentional. And once that idea took hold, it refused to go away. From the opening weeks, one thing was impossible to ignore. The Indiana Fever were grinding through a brutal stretch. Back-to-backs, short rest, elite opponents stacked early, travel that left little room to breathe. For a rookie adjusting to a faster, more physical league, it looked unforgiving. To the league, it was logistics. To fans, it looked like a test. The narrative formed quickly. Was the league throwing her into the fire on purpose? Trying to humble her? Prove that college dominance doesn't translate instantly? Reinforce the idea that reality is coming, no matter how big the hype gets? Whether that was true or not almost didn't matter. Because perception does the damage first. Clips of tired legs, heavy contact, and tough losses spread fast. Comment sections filled with accusations. Some fans saw a setup. Others defended the league. But everyone was talking about it, and that alone was a problem for the commissioner. Because once scheduling decisions become controversial, the league loses one of its most powerful tools. In the past, the schedule was a quiet equalizer. It helped balance competition, spread exposure, avoid favoritism. Now, it was being scrutinized through a completely different lens. Every tough stretch felt suspicious. Every rest day became a talking point. And then something else happened. Caitlin Clark didn't break. She adjusted. She adapted. She absorbed the pressure and kept performing. The narrative that she needed to be humbled collapsed under its own weight. Instead of slowing her momentum, the gauntlet validated it. Fans didn't see struggle, they saw resilience. That's when the conversation flipped. If the schedule was meant to test her, it failed. If it was meant to quiet the hype, it backfired. And now, with NBC fully invested, the implications were massive. Networks don't want exhausted stars. They want peak performance. They want fresh legs for national broadcasts. They want competitive games, not attrition. And once broadcast partners start making those demands, the league office loses flexibility. The commissioner now has to answer a new kind of question. Is the schedule serving the league or hurting the product? That question didn't exist before, because now the product is attached to a person. If Clark looks worn down, ratings suffer. If she's sidelined, everything stalls. That reality forces changes the league wasn't built to make quickly. Scheduling becomes tailored. Rest becomes strategic. Matchups become curated. And suddenly, the very thing the league tried to avoid, special treatment, becomes unavoidable. That's the paradox driving the commissioner's frustration. She can't openly favor one player without inflaming internal tensions. But she also can't ignore the economic reality demanding it. The schedule is no longer a neutral document. It's a battleground between ideology and survival. And fans know it. Every release of future dates now comes with speculation. Every primetime slot feels intentional. Every travel decision feels political. The trust in neutrality is gone. But the schedule was only one piece of the puzzle. Because as the league wrestled with optics and logistics, another group quietly began asserting influence. One that doesn't ask for approval and doesn't wait for press conferences. The sponsors. And once they made their preferences clear, the commissioner realized she wasn't just losing control of basketball decisions. She was losing control of the entire ecosystem. There's one group in professional sports that doesn't care about tradition, locker room politics, or internal league philosophy. Sponsors. They don't debate narratives. They follow attention. And once Caitlin Clark became the clear focal point of that attention, brands didn't hesitate. They moved fast, aggressively, and most importantly, independently. Nike didn't wait for league approval. Neither did beverage companies, equipment brands, or broadcast advertisers. Their messaging told a story the league office wasn't ready to say out loud. Campaigns centered around one face, one jersey, one number. While the league continued talking about balance, sponsors were quietly rewriting the hierarchy. This created a dangerous dynamic. Because when a player's endorsement power begins to dwarf their league salary, loyalty shifts. Not emotionally, but structurally. Decisions start factoring in sponsor priorities. Media appearances align with brand strategy. Off-season choices follow marketing calendars, not league preference. From the commissioner's perspective, this is a nightmare scenario. Her job is to secure partnerships for the league, to make sponsors invest in teams, storylines, and long-term growth. But when sponsors start bypassing the league office and working directly with one player's representation, the commissioner becomes a middleman instead of a gatekeeper. That's humiliating in executive terms. It signals that the league's authority is optional, that the real power brokers have already chosen their channel, and it doesn't run through the commissioner's desk anymore. At the same time, another force was growing louder. The fans. Not the longtime WNBA audience that understood league history and internal politics. A new wave. Louder. Larger. More emotionally invested in one player than the league itself. Fans who didn't care about balance or legacy. Fans who wanted moments, highlights, and star-driven drama. They weren't loyal to the WNBA. They were loyal to Caitlin Clark. And they made that clear every time they flooded comment sections, questioned officiating, criticized leadership, or demanded accountability from the league office. The commissioner wasn't just managing a sport anymore. She was managing a public rebellion. Every misstep was magnified. Every neutral statement was dissected. Calls for her resignation didn't come from insiders. They came from consumers. The very people now driving revenue. That's the worst possible position for any league executive. Because fans empowered by networks and sponsors don't wait for internal reform. They pressure externally. They shape perception. They force change through volume. And the NBC announcement validated them. It told this new audience that their instincts were right. That the league's future really does revolve around one star. That attention isn't evenly distributed, and never will be again. That validation isolated the commissioner even further from the league culture she came from. The one built on collective progress, slow growth, and shared credit. That culture suddenly felt outdated, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Because once sponsors align with a star, once networks build programming around her, once fans center their loyalty on her, the league becomes reactive. At that point, the commissioner isn't steering the ship. She's trying to keep it from capsizing, while someone else controls the engine. And that brings us to the final question. What happens next? Because the truth is, this story isn't ending with one media deal or one season. It's accelerating. Expansion teams are coming. New bargaining conversations are approaching. Rumors are swirling about increased demands, better protections, and structural changes that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. And at the center of all of it stands one unavoidable reality. The WNBA has entered a new era. An era where power doesn't come from position. It comes from attention. And the commissioner has to decide whether she can adapt, or whether she'll be remembered as the executive who lost control right as the league finally arrived. And here's the part nobody wants to admit. This story isn't finished. Not even close. There are already whispers about bigger demands, behind-the-scenes negotiations, and pressure points that haven't gone public yet. Expansion changes everything. New media expectations change everything. And when the next collective battle surfaces, whether it's scheduling, travel, officiating, or player power, the league's response will tell us everything. If you think the NBC announcement was loud, wait until the next move drops. Because this isn't just about Caitlin Clark anymore. It's about who actually runs the WNBA going forward. So if you want to stay ahead of this story, before the headlines catch up, make sure you're subscribed. These power shifts don't happen in public first. They happen quietly, and then all at once. And the next chapter might be the biggest one yet.